All right, so code section 674, let's open it up. If you recall on Clifford, Mr. Clifford essentially controlled all aspects of the trust, including who could benefit from the income and principal. So that was an issue of control, and Congress essentially said, look, and you guys have seen this in the assignment of income cases, that if you can control beneficial enjoyment, that is an equivalent of ownership, right? Everyone agree? So it doesn't hurt, if you don't mind me saying, that when, for exam purposes, if you can, and I know it's an exam, it's hard to do this, but take a step back, that think to yourself, just at a point at 30,000 feet in the air, hey, does it viscerally feel like this person can control it? Because if you have that visceral sense, it may signify that it's a grantor trust. I'm not saying that's the end of your analysis, and once you have that visceral sense, just mark down as a grantor trust, but I'm just saying, as a starting point, just think to yourself, does it make sense? Do you think Congress in this context would say, ignore the existence of the trust, okay? So, I'm just saying as a starting salvo, consider this for your purposes.
These cases ever get litigated anymore or not?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to tell you right now.
Using, reading, and then even illustrated material afterwards was like, yeah, this doesn't seem any different than this, so I don't know why they voted, you know.
There's a lot of confusion here, but I'm going to tell you, when we get to some of the grantor trust provisions that I think are still relevant in the year 2018, and how I mentioned to you before that people set up intentionally defective grantor trusts, and you can Google that, what code sections are utilized to achieve that objective. On one hand, I told you grantor trusts, as I said it to Karen, don't come up with any real frequency, but then I had to take a step back and say, but they come up all the time, because in many, many states, people set up revocable trusts to avoid probate. And I was recruited last night, for example, to give a speech at Roots Restaurant in Morristown. Do you know where Roots Restaurant is in Morristown?
The steakhouse?
Roots? The steakhouse in Morristown, where the old Epstein's building used to be. Anyway, someone recruited me, and and I don't know how financial planners make money these days, when they spend like $10,000 sending out circulars, and there was 25 people, and they have to pay for dinner and pay for the circulars, and I think a lot of people are there for the free dinner, and they throw in soda just to add a little spice to the menu. Anyway, the question that people will keep asking as I give this gentleman, the financial, said, please come. I want a Rutgers professor to add a little gravitas. So anyway, people who are there will ask me and say, oh, I've heard that you really have to set up revocable trust to avoid probate. But you guys know, in New Jersey, that really isn't the case. But you will have periodically, you will talk to people who run trust offices in California or Florida, where you really need to have a revocable trust. But New Jersey, you truly don't. A lot of people are under misimpression, and I'm going to sound really cynical here, and I apologize, but for a lot of my brethren attorney out there, they make a lot more money by, in addition to drafting a will, drafting a revocable trust. So it creates more legal work. More legal work means higher fees, and I'm not sure if the public is well served. So Karen, that was a long digression to say, on one hand, grantor trusts, a lot of the rules don't come up. Reversionary rules don't come up. And as we will look now, Code Section 674 doesn't come up that often at all. But Code Section 676 dealing with revocable trust all the time, right? All right. So look at Code Section 674. It says, general rule, the grantor shall be treated as the owner of any portion of a trust in respect to which the beneficial enjoyment of the corpus or the income therefrom is subject to a power of disposition exercisable by the grantor or any non-adverse party or both without the approval or consent of any adverse party. Now, if you look at the face of this language, I will say this. Based on Code Section 674A, virtually any trust anyone in this planet sets up would be considered a grantor trust. Because, just as I was alluding to before of what people do or don't do, I don't know anyone who has a adverse party who calls the shots. I mean, when I set up a trust, no one wants me to, purposely stick in an adverse party. So if you look at the language, there's no adverse party on my landscape, or to my knowledge, no one does that. So we either set it up where the grantor is the trustee, or 9 times out of 10, a non-adverse party is the trustee, and they can control beneficial enjoyment, right? Right? You name your spouse, you name a child, you name a sibling, and they can control beneficial enjoyment. Well, looks like a grantor trust. However, we're going to learn that the exceptions largely negate the general rule. So the general rule is really not the general rule, it's the exception, and the exceptions are the general rule. Is that a fair summation? Sorry, but that's the way the world is. Okay, exceptions for certain powers. Subsection A shall not apply to the following powers regardless by whom held. So, if the powers are in some form or fashion limited to what's spelled out in B, doesn't matter who holds the power, it's not going to be considered a grantor trust. Power to apply income to support a dependent, not going to be considered a grantor trust. If there's power affecting beneficial enjoyment only after the occurrence of events, well, if those events don't happen, then not going to be a grantor trust. If the power is only exercisable in a person's will, not going to be a grantor trust because you're dead, and they're not going to be a grantor trust. If there's a power to allocate among charitable beneficiaries, that's you don't have that much beneficial enjoyment because you get the money's going to inure to charity, right? One way or another. It's a question of the Red Cross or the Christian church, one or the other, but it's not coming back to you. It's going to inure to charity, so it's not going to be considered a grantor trust. Power to distribute corpus. And if these are limited to what's called an ascertainable standard, not going to be considered a grantor trust. And if your notes, what is considered an ascertainable standard in my book? Typically this, you can write in your notes, a HIMSS standard, right? Health, education, maintenance, and support. Let me repeat, HIMSS, health, education, maintenance, and support is known as an ascertainable standard. Okay? Power to withhold income temporarily, but if it ultimately that income inures to the beneficiary, not going to be considered a grantor trust. If there's power to withhold income during a disability, not going to be considered a grantor trust. And a power to allocate between corpus and income. Generally not going to be considered a grantor trust. Exception for certain independent trustees. If it's an independent trustee, read this, subsection A shall not apply, meaning the general rule shall not apply to a power solely exercisable by a trustee or trustees, none of whom is the grantor, and no more than half of whom are related or subordinate parties or are subservient to the wishes of the grantor, to distribute a portion or accumulate income to or for the benefit of beneficiaries to or for or within a class of beneficiaries, or to pay out corpus to or for beneficiaries or to or for a class of beneficiaries. In other words, independent trustees can decide who should get what, and that's not going to consider grantor trust status. So if I have Friendly National Bank as the trustee, and they can decide between and among 10 beneficiaries I've chosen, that's not going to give rise to grantor trust status. Okay, so again, 674A applies broadly, but 674B, the exceptions can be held by anyone. 674C is by independent trustees, and 674D is limited by what's called, if limited by a standard. The standard, once again, for most purposes, is this HIM standard I'm referring to. Health, education, maintenance, and support.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
that? So in 674 B5, if you're the grantor has the power to distribute corpus, and how does HIMS?
Is that if that standard is limited, that I'm the trustee and I only can distribute it to David for his health, education, support, and maintenance, that limits my discretion. And as a fiduciary, because I don't have unbridled discretion, that means that it's not considered a grantor trust.
Okay, so and that's corpus.
Well, it could be income or corpus. You're
Okay.
going to see one deals with income, one deals with corpus. B5 deals with corpus, B6 deals with income. Hold your thoughts. When we go through the problems, you're going to see how this applies.
Okay.
Hold that thought. Let's just run through some of the cases here and again, you get a better idea of where this is about, and then the statutory language I'll try, I'm not sure if I'll be successful, make it come alive. Okay. So again, you guys are getting used to this. The grantor is treated as owner if there's power to affect beneficial ownership of the corpus or the income. So typically, you have to look at each trust from two different perspectives. Who's controlling the income? Who's controlling the corpus? And who controls beneficial enjoyment? Is it the grantor or a non-adverse party? Okay? Grantor or non-adverse party without the approval or consent of an adverse party. But again, Karen, to your point, adverse parties never even come up on my radar screen. I just never saw any arrangement where someone else is going to call the shots on how things get orchestrated. That's my experience in this role. Point out the code section 674A is known much more for its exceptions than the general rule. And just point out that code section 674B are powers that can be held by anyone, including the grantor. 674C can be powers held by independent trustees. And 674D is a power which can be exercised by a trustee who's not the grantor or the grantor's spouse. So 674D is a power which can be exercised by a trustee who is not either the grantor or the grantor's spouse. We look at, there's not, again, Karen made this observation. There's not a lot of case law out there on this. It really comes down to the statute. It doesn't come up much in the year 2018. We have it, there's set up a 1950 trust. This Clark Swanson, Jr., 1950 trust. Okay? Caroline Swanson transfers common stock as trustee upon an oral declaration of trust. This is 1950. In 1952 to 1955, W. Clark transfers stock to himself as trustee, and the trust still appears to be in oral fashion. In other words, most trusts, just so you know, in theory, you don't need a written trust instrument. There is something, just so you know, only with respect to real estate do you need a trust instrument, because there's something called the statute of frauds. But aside from that, you don't need a trust instrument, a written. But guess what? You really should have a written trust instrument. An oral trust instrument it sounds to me like a good way to get involved in litigation. All right? All right, but finally, 5 years later, it's reduced to writing. In 1955, they codify the trust. But Mr. Clark apparently retains the right to interpret and amend the trust, okay? Mr. Clark retains the power to interpret and amend the trust. And did he ever exercise his power? And it looks like he did. In 1955, he amends the successor trustee provision, and he adds that the trustee in 1958 has the authority to borrow. Is having this power to amend and adjust or interpret problematic, or does he have to exercise it to be problematic? Is the mere existence of the power problematic, or is it one of those provisions that's only problematic if you exercise it, and then you're shaking your head?
I mean, the mere existence.
The mere existence, right? The mere existence of the power doesn't say under 674 you have to exercise it, right? 674 says the existence alone of the power is problematic. And by the way, doesn't that on its face seem like, you know, we talk about little power, a lot of power, but the power to amend unilaterally a trust, that's off the radar screen in terms of the power you have, right? Because this morning you wake up, you decide, oh, beneficiary C is not looking at me right. Poof, beneficiary C drops off, right? You amend the trust, right? So I'm just making the observation, that certainly seems like pretty compelling indicia of control, right? So is this a grantor trust? Do any of the exceptions apply? Okay? And we can't look at 674C or D because that's only if the grantor doesn't hold the powers. So the only way this person avoids grantor trust status is 674B, right? 674, because those are the only powers that can be held by someone, including the grantor. And if you look at 674B, well, none of them are going to save our taxpayer here. So, is this a grantor trust? And the answer is yes, it's a grantor trust, right? I would agree that it's at least a grantor trust as to the property he contributed. It's not entirely clear who Carolyn is, if it's his wife or not. It's left a little bit ambiguous, but certainly this would be a grantor trust. There's nothing here which would suggest that 674C doesn't apply because there's no independent trustee, and 674D can't apply because he was the trustee, and neither of those can apply. None of the exceptions under 674B apply. So Guess what? Grantor trust. V, you were gonna say?
No, I'm just, I'm trying to figure out the general rule versus the exceptions.
They're hard, but we're gonna
Yeah.
go through some problems, so,
Okay.
hopefully they add some form of clarity here. All right? At this tax event, this is not one of those cases you can name drop, guys. Right? With me you can, but it's not gonna be one of those well-known cases, okay? Then we have the state of Hilton Goodwin, page 269. Here, you have while the person was alive, the person did not serve as trustee. Who served as trustee here? It's important. I don't know if you recall. There was an attorney and a librarian. Okay? There was an attorney and a librarian. Okay, so how would you classify the attorney and librarian?
As,
Were they subservient? Were they adverse? Were they independent? What do you think?
they don't match the definition of subservient. I think so.
They're not subservient because they don't work for this company or for the.
Line of business, I mean,
They're going to be, can I use the word independent?
yeah, it should be.
Everybody agree? Now, notwithstanding their supposed independence, who ran the show here?
Attorney,
When you say the attorney,
the attorney, yes.
meaning, remember
A real
our
estate attorney.
our taxpayer, our grantor is an attorney himself, right?
Oh, this just,
So you gotta be careful when you say the attorney.
Lars Benson was he was the one.
We're in Goodwin, we're in the Goodwin case, not the Swenson case.
So the Goodwin was real estate attorney himself.
He was.
He was running everything.
All right, that's what's important. Everyone get it? Carl, you agree that in this case, the taxpayer, the grantor, ran everything, including making all distribution decisions, investment decisions, kept the books and records. So we could say that the trustees were in name only, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna mispronounce it. There's an SAT word, sinecure. What's the right word when you say someone's just a figurehead? You guys are gonna help me
The
out.
kingpin,
Hmm?
just joking.
Okay, so figurehead, whatever you wanna call them. All right, so, he made all management decisions, he would, make out the checks and documents, and the trustees would sign them. So, certainly looking like he controls beneficial enjoyment. He determined who should get income and how much. He told the trustees what to do, and they without question would do it. They took no independent actions. The question is this a grantor trust? This is like the Wizard of Oz. Behind the scenes, he's running everything. And in yesteryear, under the old version of the Clifford case, the old version, he would, right? He would have been the one who was considered the grantor, and he would have to, grantor trust status would apply. But after the institution of the grantor trust rules, is he considered the grantor? Because, let's face it, after the institution of the grantor trust rules, the Clifford Doctrine as a doctrine is dead, right? Because now Congress has said, we have written the rules, and either you fit within its scope. If you do, grantor trust. If you're out, you're not a grantor trust. So, notwithstanding all the control, the outcome the case holds or the court holds, what? Grantor trust or non-grantor trust? Say again, Alicia?
Grantor, because he controls.
You would think so, but no.
No?
No. Surprising answer, notwithstanding that he did everything. It was considered a non-grantor trust because it didn't fall within the scope of any of the powers. There was not a single power. It was one of those touchy-feely things. And I understand if you took a step back and you did these solid, during the exam, you take 30 seconds, you think to yourself, well, did he control it? Well, he did, but then the second stage of the analysis is now apply the code. What code section did he run afoul of? You can't point to anything because the trust was drafted in a way to be a non-grantor trust, right? The terms. And that being the case, there's nothing under 674 that was problematic.
The word is sinecure.
Yeah, what is the word?
Sinecure.
Sinecure is a,
S-I-N-E-C-U-R-E.
yes, it's a figurehead.
Well,
What's the
this one says,
definition?
a paid office or post involving minimal duties or a church benefice to whom no spiritual or pastoral charge is attached?
All right, I like the first definition.
Okay. Yeah.
Paid position in which essentially you have no duties.
Okay.
That's what was going on with these trustees. All right. What saves the day here is code section 674C. These were independent trustees. They're not subservient to the grantor. And 674C permits the trustees to sprinkle the income among the class of beneficiaries. And since these powers were held by an independent trustee, they are not attributed to the grantor. They are not attributed to the grantor. So 674A basically applies to every trust, but in this case, 674C provides an exception because the trustees here, the named trustees, were independent, and even though he controlled them, the court says you ignore that because the statute says, hey, if you don't fall within the scope, you're okay. Now, just keep in mind, so do you say, gee, I'm going to pick friendly parties and then, you know, you can run roughshod over the grantor trust rules? Keep in mind, the trustee is always going to be liable. So if I'm a trustee and I don't like what in this case, what Mr. Goodwin is telling me, you know, ultimately it's my neck on the line. Who is the beneficiary going to sue if things go wrong? Is he going to sue solely the trustee, or is he going to sue Mr. Goodwin?
Probably so.
Solid's dead. Okay? They're coming right after me. And can I just say, do you think it's going to resonate with the court? Oh, I was listening to Mr. Goodwin, and that's why I did A, B, and C. How do you think that's going to play in a court? Oh my God, during a deposition I would be torn to shreds. Because they would say, oh, what do you mean? You accepted a fiduciary duty, you were supposed to be adhering to the rules. You can't pay attention to some Goodwin just set up the trust. That was the end of his role. If you listen to him, and you listen to him in a way that the trust loses 90% of, whatever the investment, I make a poor investment based on what Mr. Goodwin said, my neck is on the line. So, yeah, in theory, Mr. Goodwin was controlling everything, but at the end of the day, these independent trustees really were ultimately, a lot was at stake, okay? The point is, the taxpayer here prevails. It is not considered a grantor trust. And I just point out in the illustrated material, what if a trust is not properly administered? In other words, the trustee sprinkles income where he does not have that power. So a trustee messes up and does things he or she or it should not do. Once again, that should not cause inclusion. Okay? It should not cause grantor trust status, because grantor trust status is determined based on the actual document, not what the trustee does or doesn't do. As Karen might point out, which it would be rightfully to do, on page 274, and I have in big letters here, item 5 in the illustrated material. For a decision that seems inconsistent with Goodwin, it cites to this investment research associates, okay? It said in which the tax court held that a grantor, rather than named trustee, quote unquote, controlled the administration of a group of trusts and was therefore taxable on all their income. On remand, the tax court again held that the grantor was taxable on all the trust income on the grounds that he had the power to appoint trust beneficiaries, and this was tantamount to a power of disposition over the trust assets. So Karen's point, my point, maybe everyone's point in this room is that there are some threads of consistency and some threads of inconsistencies. So for your notes, I'm not trying to be ambiguous, but you'll see that these cases do not follow a particular straightforward trajectory. That often there's the main case or two, but there's other people's opinions, okay, or other courts' opinions. Doesn't lend itself necessarily. I have to be careful for exam purposes to give you very crisp, very straightforward fact patterns that could not be interpreted one way or another, if you know what I mean. That, again, under my philosophy of 0 to 10, 10 being the hardest, one being the easiest, at a 9 or 10, you get into some really tough issues. Which way will the case go? But if I keep it at a level 2 or 3, there should be a right answer. Is it a grantor trust? Not. And then there shouldn't be that ambiguity, lingering. So don't look for the ambiguity. I'm not trying to, I just want you to be able to identify what is a grantor trust, guys. All right? So let's look at the problems, and David, this may, or Carlo, help open the door to see how Code Section 674.
Can I just recount Goodwin for a second?
Sure.
So Goodwin, where we might think it's going to be a grantor trust.
Right, because he seemed to control everything.
He seemed to control everything.
Everything. Behind the scenes, he did. Not seem to control, he did control.
So then he appoints puppets, or
He appoints absolute puppets.
absolute puppets.
But at the end of the day, these puppets better be careful,
Right.
because their necks are on the line.
Right, they're liable. So that, even though we see 674C, where it says the exception for certain powers of independent trustees, the court holds that these trustees truly weren't independent.
No, they do, they hold they were independent, and they qualified for this exception under 674C.
So it is a,
It's not. right?
No, look, 674C is an exception to 674A.
okay.
So
So
the
the exception
exceptions
makes
are-
it a non-grantor
So the
trust.
exception makes it a non-grantor trust.
Yes.
Oh, so the exceptions are non-grantor and the rule is grantor.
But the rule is actually very narrow. We said 674A, even though it's stated as the general rule,
Uh-huh.
it doesn't come up too often because the exceptions are so large.
See, this said that the beneficiary didn't even know that the trust existed, so is that why they felt so comfortable, like, just doing whatever he wanted? I mean, if you knew that you had this trust and somebody
Yeah,
kept like,
but
oh, they're
ultimately-
getting distributions, I'm not getting, I would start counting my this, like, give me some money, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I know, but ultimately, if the beneficiaries, at some point, the day of reckoning could come if the trust lost 95% of its value.
But they didn't even know they were beneficiaries. So I'm saying in general, though, that wouldn't happen today, you're saying, Rob. This is a little bit more like old school.
I don't know, I mean, by the way, if you wanna read an article I wrote about 10 years ago, it's called Quiet Trust. Like, you're supposed to, as a trustee, periodically keep your beneficiaries on notice about what's going on in the trust. As a matter of public policy, that makes sense, right? That, otherwise, you could do some, steal from the trust, and if the beneficiaries don't know, they have no recourse against you. So generally, from a public policy perspective, you are periodically supposed to send your beneficiaries notice about how the trust is doing from a financial perspective. Many states have instituted what are called quiet trust laws, because there's many parents out there who don't want their children to know about the trust, right? Because they're fearful of the trust baby syndrome, right? Trust child syndrome, where they know about the trust,
They're waiting.
and they're waiting, or they're not going to work, they're not going to school, they're not working hard, because, they perceive their future is set for them. So several states have relaxed their laws about putting beneficiaries on notice because the public really wanted that. So I did write a piece several years ago about so-called quiet trust.
Can you go back to that point that you mentioned earlier about exercisable? Like if the grantor, is it in perception only, or is it in,
I don't know what you mean by that.
so, say.
Mere existence versus
Right.
exercise, the ability to exercise. I think that's what he means.
So,
In this case, 674, the mere existence of a particular power can cause it to be a grantor trust. Hold that thought, Carlo. Let's just go through the problem, and then I think, fingers crossed, I think I can address your question, but again, my fingers are crossed. I'm not sure if I'll be able to deliver. 4-8. G creates an inter vivos trust. The trustee is authorized to distribute such of the income to the grantor's sister as the trustee in its sole discretion sees fit. Upon the death of the sister, the trustee is to distribute the trust principal, any accumulated income to the sister's then living issue per stirpes, meaning to the sister's children, or if a child dies prematurely, to grandchildren of the sister. First National Bank is trustee. Does the 674 treat G as the owner of any portion of the trust? Now just take a step back from 30,000 feet up and just ask yourself, okay, do you think, does the trustee feel like, do you feel like the grantor controls much going on here? So let me keep my mouth shut for 1 minute. Look at this, see if you think the grantor controls much, and then once you do your 30,000 feet up, look at code section 674 and see if the general rule applies or if any of the exceptions apply. what do you say?
Can't answer.
Can I answer, David?
I say it's, maybe I got this wrong, it's not a grantor trust.
And if so, what's your authority?
My authority is 674 with the exception because the trustee is independent. C.
Yeah,
exception-
674C.
Right.
Okay, so initially 674A makes it feel like or seem like this could be a grantor trust. But 674C says no. 674A, really, think about it, seems to capture anything. It says, grantor should be treated as owner of any portion of trust with respect to beneficial enjoyment of the corpus or income there, subject to a power of disposition, exercisable by the grantor, this is a non-adverse party. So, I mean, essentially, if you can sprinkle the income, and here the income in principle could be sprinkled, right?
As they see fit.
As they see fit. Sole discretion. So that's a pretty broad power in a non-adverse party. It has the aroma of being a grantor trust. But 674C says, nope, not if it's held by an independent party. Was that okay?
Yeah. I was looking at 674B6, but I guess the word temporarily matters.
Yeah, you don't need that here. I mean, let's go with the easy one, 674C. It's very easy to fit here. Okay, 4-9, assume the same facts as 4-8, except that G's wife is the trustee. Let's pause there. If the wife is the trustee, take a step back. Is that a problem?
Yes.
Okay, if that's a problem, do any of the exceptions apply? Can we fit it in 674C? No more, right? Because if you look at 674C, the last sentence negates 674C. And 674B, none of the exceptions will apply. And 674D is not limited by a standard. It's absolute discretion. So if you just read the first part of 4.9, this would be problematic. But if the sister's estate were the beneficiary rather than the sister's issue, look at 674B6A. And maybe this gets your point. If you have a power to distribute or apply income to or for the benefit of any current income beneficiary, that's the sister, or accumulated for her, provided that any accumulated income must ultimately be payable to the beneficiary from whom the distribution or application is withheld, to his estate or to his appointees, provided that such beneficiary possesses the power of appointment. Right, so without going any further, in other words, if it vests with the sister's estate and not with someone else, in other words, the wife here can give the sister income during her life, but if she doesn't, ultimately it's going to vest with the sister. That's not that powerful. Everyone agree that the income here, in some form or fashion, is going to vest with the sister. Agreed? So, in contrast to the prior problem, where if it didn't vest with the sister, it would end up with her children. Well, then you have two very different kind of people. You have the sister or the children. So you really are controlling beneficial enjoyment. But by way of contrast, if the assets have to vest with the children, with the sister or her estate, one way or another, the sister's going to control these assets. Everyone agree? You can't control it, or your wife can't control it, because, picture if you will, your wife either has to give it to the sister, or if she doesn't, it ends up with the sister's estate. And the sister's estate, guys, in the sister's will, she can dispose of it to whomever she wants, right? So, yes, you are controlling in some form or fashion whether or not the sister can utilize the assets, but there's something metaphysical, right, that the sister upon her death can also control the assets. So what I'm saying is, one way or another, the sister's going to control it, and even though your wife is the trustee, she has a limit on how much you can control. Where in the first part of the problem, she can withhold the money, and gee, the sister may not want it to go to her children, meaning the sister's children. She may want it to go to a boyfriend or something along those lines. So, for your notes, the first part of the problem, it would be considered a grantor trust, but if it's limited to the sister's estate, it would not be considered a grantor trust. It would qualify within that exception. How about G creates an irrevocable trust, naming herself as trustee? So, sounds interesting, right? If you're going to name yourself as the trustee. And by the way, just notice, just some phraseology, just be careful, because sometimes people get tripped up on this. These are irrevocable trusts. Everyone agree? Irrevocable. As irrevocable means you can change at any point. Irrevocable means that once it's said, you can't change it. And some people somehow extrapolate that if it's irrevocable, it can't be a grantor trust. And if there's anything you pick up tonight, I hope there's a lot you pick up tonight, but certainly irrevocable trust, any revocable trust is a grantor trust. Everyone agree? All revocable trusts are grantor trusts. But an irrevocable trust can be either a grantor trust or a non-grantor trust. Everyone agree? So just as you're reading for exam purposes, you may want to circle keywords. But in practice too, just keep in mind, irrevocable trust could be one or the other. So, creates an irrevocable trust, name yourself as trustee. The trust is authorized to distribute income or principal or both to G's adult child, A, in such amounts and at such time as the trustee deems necessary for A's support, health, and education. So that's an ascertainable standard, right? Not absolute discretion. Everyone caught that? Accumulated income not paid to A before his death is distributable to A's estate. So it's either going to A or A's estate. The trust terminates at A's death, with the remainder passing to A's descendants. The 674 treat the grantor as owner of any portion of the trust, but if the accumulated income added to principal each year was not distributable to A's estate. So take a pause, take a look, think about it for a second before answering. Let's all look at it. What exception might apply? Because certainly 674A suggest that this is a grantor trust because it suggests any trust is a grantor trust. Okay?
Did you say before it could be part grantor, part not grantor?
Could be, I mean, that's an option.
And part, okay.
Could be, isn't.
Well, it sounds like it's grantor to the corpus, but not the income.
All right, let's pause for a moment. Does 674C apply?
Yes.
No, because it's not an independent trustee.
Right.
But isn't he making himself independent?
You can't make yourself independent.
Oh,
As a
okay.
third party.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And 674D can't apply, right? Because the grantor can't be the trustee. So if we fit Karen at anything at all, it's gotta be 674B, right? And Karen, what do you say?
The six, yeah, six A to the estate for the income, but not, but obviously if the rest goes to the descendants, then not for the corpus.
But both the income and corpus are payable to the estate here, right?
But
No, it just says the accumulated income not paid is distributable to A's estate, but the remainder passing to A's descendants.
But here's my response. If, let's take the if the corpus vests with the estate, excuse me, if the income vests with the estate, code section 674B6A would apply, and it wouldn't be a grantor trust. If the income vests with the estate, if the corpus vests with the estate, 674B5A says it's not a grantor trust, okay?
Okay, so before you said income? and now
Yeah, I said income first. If it vests with the estate here, it's not considered a grantor trust as to the income. If the corpus vests with the estate, it's not a grantor trust as to corpus.
Which
And when
one
the
was that?
authors changed the fact pattern, and it's not, Karen, to your point, it's not entirely easy to understand, right? If the corpus truly vests with the, if the corpus is gonna, how do I say, vest with the estate. But certainly in the second part of the question, where it says that it's not gonna vest with the estate, then it would not be a grantor trust as to the income, okay? So in the, not to be ambiguous for your notes, but the first part of the question, you have two different exceptions, one which applies to the income, one which applies to the corpus. At least as to the corpus, there's some ambiguity of whether or not it truly will vest with this decedent's estate, the beneficiary's estate. But with respect to the second part of the question, where it says that it will not, the income will not vest with the estate, then that exception would not apply, and it would not be a grantor trust with respect, excuse me, let me reframe that. It would be a grantor trust with respect to the income. So that's what you should have for your notes. And guys, this does not really come up in practice because again, We generally don't set up trust where the grantor names him or herself as trustee. Okay?
Would exception B 674 B1 apply?
B1. What do you have? B1 is dependent. We're told it's an adult child, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Look at 4-11. G creates an irrevocable trust, naming her brother as trustee. The trustee is authorized to distribute income or principal or both. So, going to name the brother. Trustee is authorized to distribute income or principal or both to G's children in such shares and such amounts and at such times as the trustee deems appropriate for any purpose. So it's sprinkling, right? No ascertainable standard there, right? At the death of the last to survive of G's children, the remaining assets pass to G's then living descendants, namely, let's say, the grandchildren. Does 674 treat G as the owner of any portion of the trust? Hey, let's just pause for a second. Does 674A apply? Yes, okay? Initially, because there's complete discretion. Now the question is, do any of the exceptions apply here? And what do we know about the brother? What's his relationship? He's a subordinate party, right? Under the definitions under 672. So B, is it an independent trustee? No.
I don't, okay.
But section 674C does not apply. And does 674D apply? No, it's not limited by an ascertainable standard, right? And I think you could scour Code Section 674B, you're not going to find any exception here. So this would probably be treated as a grantor trust, as to income and principal. Because you have this subservient party doing anything you want on your behalf.
This happens a lot in life. I see this a lot. The brothers and sisters that make the brothers and sisters as trustees.
I see a lot of brothers and siblings being named as trustees. Okay, so you got to be careful, or else you're going to have grantor trust status. Okay? And the second part of the question says, would it matter if it was limited by an ascertainable standard?
Yes, I think you would. Because it's one of the exceptions.
Yeah, if it's limited by an ascertainable standard, then you have Code Section 674D. Right? All of a sudden, 674D is going to limit grantor trust status in this context because it's limited by an ascertainable standard. Go ahead, Karen.
I get health education, that's a little more, okay, definable, like maintenance and support, you could kind of.
I know you and I could debate this all night,
Yeah.
but I'm just telling you that it's historically been considered an ascertainable
Okay,
standard.
okay, that seems like that'd be kind of easy to get around.
No, I agree.
Can you give an example, like an example of an ascertainable standard?
That's literally, this is how it's written, David.
Yeah.
I mean, I've written a lot of trust, and I've read a lot of trust, and it will say, upon my demise, to hold the assets in trust for the health, education, maintenance, and support of my spouse. Period.
And that's the standard.
That's a standard.
It doesn't say a certain percentage or anything, just,
What?
there's no limit on,
No,
that.
I mean, if my spouse or David's spouse needs it, she can bang on the desk and say, listen, I need $3,000 a month for for my maintenance, for my custom standard of living, and the trustee has to decide whether or not that the custom standard of living makes sense. And sometimes it says, for my health, education, maintenance and support, and it says, comma, taking into account my spouse's existing assets, or sometimes it's silent. So sometimes David says, well, I don't want my trustees to dip in here if my spouse has other assets. Particularly in a second marriage, you might say, only use it if, if your spouse doesn't have recourse to other assets.
She's gonna need a lot more than $3,000 a month, I'll tell you that.
We're not going there. All right, so this one doesn't come up too often. I will tell you, because we're not going to get to it right now, but, well, Code Section 675, let me just share with you at this juncture. 675 is entitled Administrative Powers. And I told you before, and we're going to see it play out shortly, that that if you have certain administrative powers, it can cause grantor trust status. No surprise there. Okay? It can cause grantor trust status. Now, remember, tax planners walk a fine line. That in the year 2018, they like grantor trust status. And they like it for several reasons. They like grantor trust status because if it's a grantor trust, it may be taxed ultimately the income at lower tax rates than Code Section 1E, which is essentially a flat 37% rate, right? That's one advantage. And we're going to see, secondly, in a moment, if you haven't already read, there's a revenue ruling, 85-13, 85-13, that if you sell an asset to a grantor trust, is that recognized or not recognized for tax purposes? Do you recall? Is it treated as if you had an actual sale, or is it ignored for tax purposes? Not sure. Okay? Not sure. Sure? Not sure? Anyone sure or think they know? If you engage in a sale with a grantor trust, is it treated like a real sale or is it ignored? Ignored?
I thought it's ignored, yeah.
Okay. Let me give you two different, Karen will like this, two different answers. On the one hand, right, truly on one hand, we're going to look at the Rothstein decision where the court says, hey, if you have a grantor trust, the only thing that Code Section 671 says is where to report income. It doesn't say ignore the transaction. It says if Ming sells an asset to a grantor trust, let's say Apple stock she bought for 100, it's now worth 1,000, and there's a $900 gain, so be it. Or if the grantor trust sells you an asset, it will pick up the gain, and if it picks up the gain, it will end up on your tax return. In other words, grantor trust status simply tells you where things show up on a tax return, but it doesn't say to ignore the transaction. Code Section 1041, where there's a transaction between spouses, says to ignore the transaction. Everyone agree? But if you look at the Rothstein decision, the authors of that opinion say nothing in the code says say to ignore it. It just says where it goes on a tax return. So that's one hand. The IRS at the time didn't like that outcome and said there's too much potential manipulation there. So on the other hand, now we're going to see there's a revenue ruling 85-13 that comes out after the Rothstein decision, and it says ignore the transaction. That it's as if it's a nullity. So that if you sell, Ming sells Apple stock to her grantor trust, it's ignored for tax purposes. There's no gain, no loss, because it's like you're looking in the mirror and you're selling it to your alter ego, right? And it should be ignored. So what we're gonna see is, I was telling you why grantor trust status is popular, is because one, the tax burden may be less, and two, that people will look to sell appreciated assets to effect what's called intentionally defective grantor trust. So they actually sell their assets to a trust, which is a grantor trust, which is for their children's benefit. So their children get this new asset, and it's grantor trust status, so there's no gain or loss when they sell this to the grantor trust. And here's what they want to do. The taxpayers who set up these trusts, they want to keep whatever assets are in the grantor trust out of their estate. Okay, so they have to thread a careful, what's the cliche? That they thread the needle carefully, right? And what I mean by that is, you want to set up a grantor trust because of these low tax rates and that the trust is ignored, but they don't want the assets which are held in the trust includable in their estate. And we know, let me just make a general statement. If you had to think about it, should most grantor trusts be includable in the decedent's estate if they die while the grantor trust status is applicable? What's your gut? You would say, excuse my language, hell yes, right? Because the notion of a grantor trust sort of signifies the person had an addition of control, right? Everyone with me? I mean, how do you think we got the moniker grantor trust? Because the person like Clifford had so many hands in the cookie jar, Congress said you should be taxing the income, right? So here we're going to perform a magical feat. People want grantor trust status, but they don't want it includable in their estate, okay? So you have to, now, if you have a revocable trust, is that going to be includable in your estate? Yes. I think it's Code Section 2037 that says if you have, or 2038, one of the two of those, that if you have a power of revocation, it causes inclusion in your gross estate. And many of the powers enumerated here that on your 6 fingers, Alicia, will cause inclusion. However, if you look at Code Section 675, 4C, Code Section 675, 4C, this is called a power of substitution. Everyone see that? Code Section 675, 4, it's entitled General Powers of Administration. You see C, a power to reacquire the trust corpus by substituting other property of equivalent value. Everyone see that power of substitution? That power of substitution, the power to acquire or reacquire, to replace property, causes grantor trust status. So if David sets up a trust and he retains the right to take, if the trust owns Apple stock, but he retains the right to replace the $1,000 of Apple stock with $1,000 of IBM stock or $1,000 of Blackacre, pick it whatever. As long as he replaces it of something of equivalent value, doesn't seem like much of a power, right? Everyone agree? Like, does David, do you feel much stronger by having that power? Do you feel like you really control that trust? And the answer is, let me feed you. I'll be like the hypnotist. Let me feed you this one. No, right? But it causes grantor trust status. So, again, Congress went over the top a bit here when grantor trust status was a problem and made this very tiny power triggering grantor trust status. But in the year 2018, people like David are happy to use this power because utilization of this power causes grantor trust status, but what it doesn't do, it doesn't cause estate tax inclusion. You can look at chapter, let me do my math right, chapter 11 of the Internal Revenue Code deals with the estate tax, and there's nothing there that says if you have a power of substitution, will cause estate tax inclusion. So many practitioners, Karen, to answer a question you raised before, does this come up in practice? People purposely put this power of substitution, if they want, in their trust documents because it causes grantor trust status, but it does not cause estate tax inclusion. And that can be a powerful tool for saving income tax and mitigating estate tax burden. Go ahead, Dave.
Can I ask, just back to your first example, I take stock, I sell stock to the trust.
It's
and
not recognized.
It's not recognized. So now the stock is, Apple stock is now in the trust, and it's for the beneficiaries, which are my children. When is the gain? The stock is obviously appreciated, and the basis for the trust is
It's
the,
100, it's worth 1,000.
I'm sorry?
The basis is 100, worth 1,000. Keep
Okay,
going.
so it's, the basis is, my basis is 100 before I sell. I sell it to the trust for 1,000.
Yeah, it's ignored
It's
under this
completely
revenue
ignored.
ruling 85-13.
The-
And now the trust makes a distribution to your son.
Right.
How much income does your son have?
900.
The lower of a hundred.
Is it? It's the lower.
Say V?
The lower of 100 or 1,000.
Right, that's section 643
So
E.
it's, so his basis is 100. So he's got a $900 gain
When he sells it.
when he
If
sells.
the trust makes it, he will when he sells it.
Right,
He'll have a
right,
$900 gain,
Right,
absolutely.
right. Okay.
All right, everyone happy with that outcome? And if you don't mind me saying, David, yes, you could sell it to the Apple stock, or 2 years later, you could decide, gee, I'm going to exercise my power of substitution and replace the Apple stock with a different stock.
Caterpillar.
Yeah,
Right.
as long as it's of equivalent value.
So now the trust sells the stock, doesn't make a distribution, makes a cash distribution to my son.
Right. Now, if it sells the stock on the 1041, it has to include it in the income.
So,
It's capital gain, so it's not includable in D&I. Keep going.
so it's a $900 capital gain to the trust, and it makes a $1,000 distribution to my son.
Yep.
And my son picks that up as,
Maybe, depends on the D&I of the trust.
okay, let's say the DNI was high enough,
They'll pick it up as income.
he picks it up as ordinary income.
So-
Or a capital gain, which,
It depends on the D&I, the composure of the D&I of the
Right.
trust,
okay,
right?
yeah.
Other questions? Now look, just so I know, on Friday, admittedly, it's because I have to be in New Orleans to do this tax conference. So again, if you can't make it, completely understood, and again, we have our videographer here, I feel like it's a wedding ceremony. But just by a show of hands, because I really do want to bring dinner, if you can't make it, I just want to know how much or what I should get. So can I just see by a show of hands who I'll be here. So we have about 7 or 8 people who can be here in
I'm like 50-50.
50-50.
Well, because I don't know, I have a birthday party on Saturday, so I have.
I'm gonna try and make it.
So I don't, I'm gonna know on Thursday,
All right.
how much.
I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense. It looks like most of you can be here, great. If you can't, again, watch the videotape. And if you can't be here, just make sure you finish reading this chapter, and then for a week from today, make sure you read the chapter, if you could, that I distributed regarding charitable trust, okay? Everyone got that? If you have a problem, that's right.
Put it on the blackboard?
I sent an email out around 5:30.
Oh, okay, I didn't see that.
Okay, so have a good night, and we'll see most of you on Friday, okay?